So we're going to talk about outcompeting with digital and AI. And I'm going to start by talking about generative AI. So as Celia said, I lead McKinsey Digital. It's about half of our firm now, if we look at the total client work that we do that comes under McKinsey Digital. It's about a quarter of our people, about half of our client work. And in McKinsey Digital, we do three things. We help people build new digital businesses, we help modernize core technology, and we help transform businesses, do classic digital transformation, enabled by AI. However, since the beginning of January, you'd think we'd only done one thing, which is talk about generative AI, because it is the only thing the world wants to talk about. And I've probably been invited to more boards in the last 6 months than I have in the last 5 years combined. And I would assert that every major board on the planet is having a conversation on AI between March and December of this year. So how did we get to where we are? Is Gen AI overhyped? Certainly yes. However, if you look at it in the lens of the 30-year AI story and not the 6-month Gen AI story, then we say this is a very, very real trend. I was with the board just a couple of weeks ago, actually, and I was waxing lyrical on how AI is going to change the world. And a board member sort of put up his hand and asked me, he said, OK, that's fine, but will you take a bet with me that generative AI is going to be worth more next year than my NFT portfolio is this year? Like, you know, good way to ask the question. And again, in the context of the 30-year AI trend, I would take that bet. So what's different and what's special about generative AI? All the prior versions of the technology, which we've sort of cartoon stereotyped on here, are one model, one purpose. You want to try to reduce customer churn, build a special model. You want to try to build a better supply chain, build a better model. You want to try to understand how to optimize pricing or employee, where to look for the next new set of employees, build a specific model. The promise of generative AI, it's the all-purpose model. It's what's called a foundational model that with minimal work and with work that can be done by non-technical people can be applied across many, many AI problems. It's not quite as simple as that. I'll get into it. But the power of these multi-purpose, sort of the Swiss Army knife of AI models that can be applied against many different tasks is going to be an enormous democratizer and expander of the power of AI. So this is not my phrase. I wish it was, because I think it's a very clever phrase. Gen AI is both smarter and dumber than any person you've ever met. So what do we make of a technology that can pass the bar exam, right? GPT-4 is more than 90% on the bar exam. GPT-3 was only 10%, so quite an improvement. It can pass AP history, AP math. It can do passably pretty well at AP chemistry. How well you recognize these tests is probably a measure of the age of your children at this point. So it can do these amazing things that you'd consider to be a pinnacle of human achievement. But then if you ask it how many E's are in ketchup, it generally gets that wrong, right? So what do you make of something that can pass the bar exam but would probably fail nursery school? And the reason is how it works. It's essentially looking for associations in all the public text that's out there on the internet. And it turns out people have written some crazy things about ketchup out there. So it will get simple things like that wrong. So it's a very powerful technology, but it's not the technology for all purposes. And more we're seeing impact from it when it's combined with other forms of AI to achieve a more integrated result. It's also leading to some pretty interesting questions around what does it mean for talent, right? We were actually talking about this within McKinsey's board just a few months ago. What does it mean for our talent strategy? If you think about the typical McKinsey business analyst or MBA profile, it's somebody who's a great communicator, somebody who knows a little about a broad range of subjects, someone who can do repeated analysis very well, often late at night. My phone can do all that now in milliseconds, right? So like, what's going to be the value of that to us in the future? So the debate we're having and the bet we're beginning to make is, yes, some of those skills, the ability to communicate well in a document and so on, will be commoditized. But we're going to see an increase in value in 3 areas. Number 1, real creativity, right? The models can simulate creativity. They're probabilistic, but they're not actually creative. Number 2, technical skills. And there's a bit of a paradox here, because the models are supposed to be and are incredibly easy to use. But as I'll explain in a moment, they're also going to massively increase demand for data engineering and certain other technical skills. So real technical depth. And then number 3, and frankly, this one's a bet, and maybe we're being optimists, leadership. people who can actually lead, set goals, build a team, motivate, align, and so on. At least for now, the models can't do that as well as the humans. Maybe GPT-7 will, but for now, I think we're ahead. So the economic potential. So McKinsey Global Institute, so our economic think tank that you're probably familiar with, has done a lot of modeling of what's the impact going to be of AI overall and GenAI in particular. And I realize as I show this chart, it sort of draws your eyes to the wrong place because you look at it and you see this enormous bar in high tech and in retail, and then smaller bars in agriculture and insurance and so on. But the real message from this chart is these are 50 to 250 billion in every industry, right? So no matter what industry you're looking at, the impact here is going to be enormous. And we actually see, or McKinsey Global Institute sees this, as being essentially an 8-year pull forward of what people thought the economic impact of AI was going to be. There aren't many fields where you wake up one morning and you realize your assumptions were off by 8 years, right? Everything gets pulled forward. So it's pretty amazing in terms of what it can do. The other interesting thing, though, is the impact's actually pretty concentrated. If you look across all of those functions, there's about 65 use cases in these, so all those industries, in these 6 or 7 functions that are driving more than 3/4 of the value. And I'll get more specific. I'll sort of relate these to applications in a moment. But yes, this will transform legal. Yes, this will transform corporate. This will transform finance and so on. But it'll really, really transform sales and marketing, the software or technology function, anything to do with customer operations, and anything to do with product R&D or technical operations. And what we've tried to look at here is how big is the function? And of course, those are some of the bigger functions. But then what percentage of the function gets impacted? Because what we find is if you're changing 10 or 15% of somebody's spend in a function, that generally is augmenting or changing jobs. People work a little differently. Once you're up above 15%, then you're in the zone where actually jobs are going away, maybe being replaced in other areas by other jobs, but where you're actually making more substantial changes to what that workforce looks like. So how are people really, really using it today? So I've been fortunate enough in the last few months to talk to probably more than 200 chief executives and boards on what we see going on. And at the end of most of those discussions, I ask, how are you actually really, really using it today? And if you ask technical people, you'll get some good technical answers. But if you ask sort of a general business leadership audience, how are people really using it today? The most common answer, birthday poems, retirement speeches, travel planning, right? It's like the fun stuff. And when you look at what's going on in their companies, there's actually lots of corporate equivalents of the birthday poem and the travel stuff. There's the professor at Stanford, Chris Rhee, uses the phrase sugar water use cases. And many people have found these use cases that are easy to do, give a quick pop that you're getting something out of it, but might not actually have lasting enterprise scale impact. That's changing, though, right? We see an enormous pipeline, and the example you mentioned in customer care is one of the examples I'll use, actually. An enormous pipeline of real enterprise-scale use cases that are moving down the pipe now and that will be launched in the next few months or have been launched in the last few months. Within McKinsey, we're working with, at this point, nearly 200 clients on actually building enterprise GenAI applications. 90% of what we're seeing is falling in these 4 categories, the 4 Cs. So I'll spend a few minutes just giving a little bit of a tour of what we're seeing on here. So the first category, like the customer care example, is absolutely customer journeys or patient journeys if you're in healthcare. And the impact potential we're seeing here is enormous. A telecoms company we're working with is targeting an 80% productivity improvement in their customer call centers and sort of customer operations functions. An e-commerce player has already taken a 50% improvement in essentially sales and marketing operations and customer support. They don't have all the applications yet to support that, but they think they will by the beginning of next year. That was the first bounce of the ball, a productivity conversation. There's been a real shift since the beginning of the summer, though, as people are now seeing the growth conversation is as compelling, or I personally think even more compelling, than the productivity conversation. So to bring that to life, there was a paper that came out, or a study that came out over the summer from the UK, actually with doctors, right, that I'll use to illustrate the point. So a set of academics decided to see if patients could tell the difference between a doctor who was texting them and one of the chatbots. I think it was GPT 3.5. So patients were assigned one or the other, interacted with them a little bit, and then it flipped over. And then they asked the patients, could you tell the difference? And to the disappointment of the researchers, on average, they could. Even pretty elderly patients, more than 70% of the time, could tell what was the chatbot and what was the doctor. But they then asked a follow-up question. They said, which one did you prefer? The patients overwhelmingly preferred the chatbot. They said it was more informative, but they also said it was more empathetic. So, my brother's a doctor in the UK, so I find the data very easy to believe. But I think, it's more importantly than any comments on the NHS is it actually foreshadows what we're going to see in terms of how companies can build new relationships with their customers and their stakeholders. And what this means for how you can engage a customer, deepen a relationship, think about cross-sell, upsell, and so on, it's enormous. And we're really just at the very beginning of people using that in customer journeys. So that's the first flower petal on here. The second flower petal, it's a word that I was accused that we made up, concision, but we've said it enough times that by next year I'm hoping it will be in the dictionary. And it's concise plus precision. And already you can ask, what are the drivers of global soybean production or something, and you can get an amazingly summarized answer on your phone in milliseconds. That's somewhat useful, but what's really useful is if you can combine the ability to do that with your organization's own private data. And if you can do that in a way that has the right one-way valves on it, and if you can do that in a way that takes context into account in the right way, so it can tell the difference between what's good, recent, relevant information by someone who knows what they're doing versus what some other random company document that happens to be in the archive. It's quite hard to do, but when you do it well, we're actually seeing amazing examples of people setting up virtual experts. So a mining company we work with has done this for its large equipment. Instead of having the classic PDF maintenance manual, you can now have a chat maintenance manual. The biggest difference is users actually use it, right? Instead of having to thumb through, they're really using it, therefore they're getting better results. Therefore, they're also learning all sorts of things about preventive maintenance and predictive failures and so on. I was interested to hear Richard's comments on Taiwan, but a Taiwanese electronics company that we work with is using this in their product development function. They think they have some amazing engineers and some more average engineers. So how do you actually upskill your engineers to get that expertise into the best ones? Another thing we found as we're doing this, actually this work was with a law firm. If you're a lawyer, if you're a second-year associate and you don't know the answer to something, who do you ask? You ask your office mate who's the third-year associate, right? Which might not actually be the best of the firm's expertise. The nice things about these virtual expert systems is you democratize access to the 20-year senior partner in that law firm who really does know things rather than just the more typical phone-a-friend approach. I'll show you in a moment what we've actually built inside McKinsey in that virtual expert example. The third one on here is coding, and despite my comments about using this for birthday poems, the software engineers are very much ahead of the game and really are using this in a very significant way. So what we've seen is if you give people the automated coding tools out of the box, you get about a 20% productivity improvement. If you then put some training routines around that, that goes to a 55 to now 75% productivity improvement in software development. What does that mean? That means the costs of developing software have halved since the beginning of the year. They might halve again by the middle of next year. If you think about what that means for build versus buy decisions within your organization, if you think about what that means for the enterprise software industry, which has, by the way, been one of the best private equity investments of the last few years, and the sort of the new competition we're going to see in there as the cost to develop falls way, way down, this is a dramatic change. By the way, if you give these tools to bad developers, you see a 7 to 8% decrease in productivity because they just develop more bad code more quickly. But that's sort of the productivity version. Again, first bounce of the ball. Second bounce of the ball is what it means for your technology strategy, right? And in many organizations, I'm sure there's no one in this room who has this trouble, you're saddled with mainframe or really old technology, and you spend an enormous amount of time paying COBOL developers to keep those machines fed and alive. And every year you're deciding, do we stick with what we have? It's painful, but it's fully depreciated. Do we move to something new? It's the bane of most CIOs and most boards as they look at tech spend. This technology has the promise to change that equation. Because instead, you can actually write the automation sequences, basically emulators, that will let you code in more modern languages and will let you then have that automatically translated into the older languages you need in the older systems. So it can keep that older stuff around for longer, and therefore allow you to shift your technology spend away from all the infrastructure and maintenance stuff and into all the modern app dev that you actually want to do. I don't want to overstate that one. It's still, I would say, bouncing around the proof of concept stage, but a massive strategy shift if it pans out as it could. The fourth category on here is creative content. So you've all seen, I expect, and played around with all the fun things you can do with images, right? The potential here is amazing. Most big companies, by the way, are realizing they need their own proprietary image databases, and it's just too risk-fraught to rely on what the models pull from the public internet. But amazing things you can do there. Amazing things you can do with personalized marketing and individual outreach campaigns. But also, a molecule is an image too. So we're helping clients do really interesting things on taking a chemistry, how you can create some variations around it that might be greener or that might have different or better properties, or how you can actually use a molecule and look at all the different uses that has to actually search the literature in a much more efficient way to find uses for it that you couldn't find before. Or, again, sort of second bounce of the ball, there's a fantastic example that's emerged from China in the last few weeks. So you've probably all seen live stream sellers online, right? It's an enormous business in China. It's a smaller business in the rest of the world, where people are on the internet all hours of the day and night selling different consumer products. So there's a company in China now where you give them $1,000 and 1 minute of video. It used to be 3 minutes. They got it down to 1 minute. And they will create a virtual seller for you. They will take that video and they will turn it into an avatar that can sell whatever product you like. It works 24/7. It doesn't eat too much. It won't be as good as your best seller, but it's actually outperforming the average seller that most companies have within their sort of repertoire of live stream sellers right now. In the space of a few months, there are now 400,000 of these out there online selling consumer products day and night. 400,000. The wages for real live stream sellers have dropped apparently more than 20%, right, since the arrival of the bot sellers. How this plays out is going to be really interesting. Now, listen, that one might be a bit of a sort of a particular quirk that might be regulated out of existence. But what that shows is sort of a microcosm of what the technology can do. I think is a fascinating example. So I hope I didn't make it sound too easy, because it's not. This is probably too technical a page I wouldn't talk to you by walking through all of this. But what I would stress on this page is 80+% of the public conversation is focusing on box 3 in here, the foundation model. And there's a lot of discussion around, is OpenAI better than Bard? The New York Times was being critical of Bard this morning. What is it better? How does Anthropic compare to Cohere and so on? The reality is the models are the same, right? Or at least there's probably 6 to 8 models that all perform the same way. Stanford and some other institutes have benchmarked this extensively. They all source to the same now public Google model that was originally from a language translation back in 2018. They're all small variations around that. There's a community of about 150 people who are all each other's students and postdocs and so on who know how to develop these models. They perform the same. This is not going to be like search, where you're going to see one pull up way ahead of the others, and there's just sort of a better mousetrap out there. Does that mean they're commodities? No, it doesn't, because there's 6 of them. There aren't 20 of them. And there are some important architectural choices. Some people will be comfortable sending their data to somebody else's model to run in a cloud environment. Other people will want a model that will run entirely within their data environment. Some people will be comfortable partnering up with one of the big cloud players. Other people will say, I actually want to avoid vendor lock-in, and I want to have an approach that allows me to sit above the cloud and switch then between different models and different cloud providers. So different architectural choices. But that's 15% of the story, maybe 20%, when we look at the solutions we're helping build, what it means for total cost, total effort. So that box 3 is 15, 20%. The other 80, 85% is before the model and after the model. Before the model, how you do prompt engineering, how you do context engineering to put your company's data in there in the right way and with the right one-way valves. Then after the model, how you do the post-processing, how you actually build what's called a machine learning operations sort of back end to allow it to be safe, stable, scalable, minimize the hallucinations, avoid any, measure and avoid any bias in there and so on. These two things end up being the harder part. So what's the point of showing you this? Not to say it's impossible, right? Everything on this page is a solvable problem by your organization or by people your organization will know. But this is effort. And when we see organizations trying 150 generative AI pilots or taking a bottom-up approach to use case prioritization, we really worry about that. To do this well, you're only going to have a couple of spots where you can do it. So our approach is very much pick somewhere where there's real value, build out this robust solution architecture there, then scale it from there. Don't go try it in lots of different places. There's a sort of a simple discussion framework we're using with organizations on where do you want to be a taker, where do you want to be a shaper, where do you want to be a maker. So we've seen some companies early on experimenting in what they thought were safe areas, right? Let's go build one of these in HR, we'll write job descriptions, we'll crawl LinkedIn. Or let's write one of these for finance, we'll summarize financial information for management and so on. That's fine, but we generally end up concluding that's a bit of a waste of your company's innovation brain cells because the software industry is going to do that for you, right? Why put your effort into things that Workday or SAP or whomever else are just going to build in as features to their products? So anywhere where it's not really going to be a competitive advantage, it relates to an enabling function and so on, there you can be a taker, right? Assess it, see if it's good enough, pick it up when it works for you. Instead, we're saying, think about where you want to be a shaper. What are the places where you're going to drive real competitive advantage if you get it right? What are the things that are your company's special sauce? And that's where you actually will need to build something proprietary, right? Doesn't mean build from scratch, but assemble from components something proprietary that's going to work for you, right? Where you can be a shaper. In that light, we said, look, for us, McKinsey, knowledge management is something that we thought was proprietary, special, and differentiating for us. So that's where we chose to be a shaper. We went outside, we looked at lots of different off-the-shelf tools. None of them we thought could do what we wanted them to do. So we went and built our own that I'll describe in a second. Some companies will go even further and say, I'm going to be a maker. I'm going to create my own large language model. Bloomberg is famously doing this with financial data for good reasons, because they're very cautious about who they want to give that raw data to, so they want to sort of build their own. But for most companies, that's going to be an extremely expensive and probably unnecessary undertaking. So if you look at the thing that we chose to shape, this is just a very simple sort of chat interface for all of our consultants. We're up to about half of our consultants so far. It'll be all by the end of October. And what it allows the team to do is just to ask a simple question like, how do I do a retail store operations diagnostic? And it will then search across 42 different databases inside the firm, 150,000 hours of external interviews that we've digitized, our sanitized staffing logs that say who's worked on what sort of project in what industry, and out comes a sort of draft answer to the question, right? Here's the approach. It sources it to specific internal documents. It names specific experts to call. And then if you click to another panel, it will ask the same question on like an open, on sort of just sort of a general open AI model with confidentiality protections around it. And it will give you, what does the outside world think is the answer to that question? What can you find in Harvard Business Review and so on? Is this going to replace what our teams do? No. Is this going to massively accelerate what our teams do? Absolutely. We're finding people love it. And more importantly, or as importantly, we're finding it's been an incredible learning for us on what it really takes to do that complicated architecture that was on the prior page. When we first had the MVP of this, it was going to cost us $1.70 per query, right, for any team that used it. That would have blown up the firm pretty quickly. So happily, we were able to figure out through context engineering, through prompt engineering, how to get that down to 1-point-something cents per query. And we've got it down fourfold since then, since launching it. So how to solve problems like that, and in particular, how to get that context engineering right, and how to build a prompt library so people use it in the right way. These are all sort of tricky skills. I don't want to say super hard or impossible skills, but they're part of sort of the know-how companies will need to develop as they move forward in this space. How does that tie back to our book? So we are thrilled and amazed by the success of this book that reached number 3 on the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. When we wrote it, we were literally taking the McKinsey manual that we give our teams. We thought we'll publish it, and maybe some business school bookshops will pick it up and so on. But we timed it extremely luckily with the AI wave, and we're very happy with the amount of interest that it's generated. But what's in the book is, as we look across AI-powered transformations, what we find is every company on the planet has one. At the time of we started writing it, 91% of companies said they had one. I bet that math is like 99% now. But only 25 to 30% of them were actually making money. It's 25% on cost, 30% on revenue. We're hitting their financial targets. So what we tried to do was take 200 of the better ones, the ones that did hit the targets, and reverse engineer the playbook. And this is what we got to as the playbook. So I won't try and summarize the 400 pages in too much detail, but just sort of at a highlight, it starts at the top. The most common failure mode was a chairman or a CEO saying, we're going to go do AI, we're going to go digital, and you get 1,000 filers blooming, and every part of the organization goes off and does their own thing. And that's what we worry about now again with GenAI, because GenAI is so easy to pilot and actually so hard to get that enterprise scale impact. We worry it's going to set us back to sort of 2018 in digital with this death by 1,000 pilots. The second failure mode was lack of a bold financial objective, or in fact, lack of any financial objective often. Companies that set a target of 15 to 20% EBITDA were more likely to actually achieve a higher percentage attainment on that target. So what does that mean? That means if you're aiming for a big prize, you're more likely to hit 90+% of that prize than you are if you're aiming for a small prize, where you're likely to hit less than half of the prize. Why is that? We don't really know, but we suspect it's because getting this right requires real resource commitment and real cross-functional working. And that doesn't happen unless the company's aligned on a goal that's big enough. So a real top-down roadmap that is business-led or business and technology partnered. Next comes talent. And we've been amazed and impressed by how far companies have gone with upskilling existing talent. It turns out that rating Silicon Valley companies for top talent is a great way to change the company dress code, but not a great way to change the company culture. That generally hasn't stuck. So companies have really invested in upskilling and reskilling have really been the more successful ones. Next one on here is operating model. And I wish I had a different word than agile, because the Agile Manifesto is sort of old enough to have graduated from college by now. But every company who was in the success group in the sample was in some version of agile, right? And what that means is not just agile in the technology function, but business and technology working together and the control functions. If you don't have legal, regulatory compliance, whatever it is in your industry, also in agile, you're not going to get the benefits. Next is technology, and we saw more winners who actually underspent in technology rather than overspent, right? People who've done the $200 million, first let's build a giant data lake, then we'll get to do amazing things. That's generally not a path to glory. Instead, yes, your data does need to be in the cloud. Yes, your data does need to be at least indexed, if not perfectly structured. But doing that in focused areas where there's business value, rather than doing that everywhere, everything everywhere all at once, turns out to be by far the better strategy. Next is data governance. We can spend a lot of time on that, but it's much more of an org problem than a technology problem. But many companies think they're always one use case away from AI nirvana. It's never true. You actually need to transform in a domain, often with 10 or 11 different use cases. To get that to work, your data needs to be well organized. So companies who really invested in that were able to get a march ahead. And then finally, adoption and scaling. And there's lots of sort of the general change stuff in adoption and scaling. It's got to be led from the top. You've got to have a clear change story. But one thing that stood out above all else in that area was incentives. Right? When you're asking the question, who's responsible for adoption of some new AI approach, and everybody turns and looks at the CIO, that's the wrong answer. Right? It actually needs to be baked into the business leader's goals and the functional leader's goals, just the same way as it would be if it was a cost program or a revenue program or something. So with the other change management levers, it's not only incentives, but the importance of incentives stood out really clearly. So much of the book was written in the very early days of GenAI, so it doesn't capture all of the most recent thinking. But we think, if anything, the explosion in the last 6 months of GenAI is underscoring the key messages here around taking a top-down approach and really investing in upskilling your talent. So we had a look at, detailed look at what their actual consumer-facing apps were, and then a detailed look at how they operated. And what we saw was, yes, it was true the apps were basically the same, right? Someone might have a feature a few months ahead of somebody else, but it was quickly imitated. But if you looked at who was making money, and in their case it was revenue through new digital channels, it was value per customer, it was are you taking down headcount in the branches, ultimately how it flowed through to ROE, you could see about the same math applied. About 25% of them were making money, about 3/4 of them really weren't, right? So for a quarter, it was leading to what we think will ultimately be differentiation. So then if you look at the work practices and you say, well, what are they doing that's different, right? If the sort of, the veneer is the same, right? What's under the hood that's different? And this is what that data showed. And what it shows is actually, in the case of these banking companies, it was the soft stuff, right? Have you actually built a proper career track for technical talent, right? The technical people coming in, knowing they're going to work for great technical people, and knowing they're not going to be treated like the IT help desk, but instead they're going to be like, real sort of co-leaders in the business. Banks who had that was a much better discriminating question than, does your app have such and such a feature, right? Or companies where you had a business and tech collaboration model, right, that was really humming well. Or customers who really had thought through how technology people were working in an environment with the right data products. Those were the things that made a difference. So I don't know that this automatically translates across all industries, but we've been really impressed how players within industries who've been able to create the right tech career ladders, and frankly, we've done a lot of this inside McKinsey, right? Because 8 years ago, we hardly had any people with deep technical backgrounds. So figuring out how to bring in amazing technical people and not have them feel that they're going to be, sort of back office to the MBAs has been something we spent a lot of time working on. And the companies who succeed are the ones who are able to do that. So actually, one of the examples we profile in the book, it's the one I was just talking about that's in Baghdad, Arizona, is a Freeport Mining. It's a copper miner. And they're an example of a company that got amazing impact through AI. And this was pre-generative AI, right? Maybe I'll just tell their story in the 1 minute, 30 seconds I have left. So, at the site they have in Arizona, they've been mining copper for nearly 100 years, right? And I live in New York City, there's only so much I know about the mining industry, but as I understand it, the process is, the ore comes out of the ground at about 1% concentration. They put it into a copper concentrator, it comes out at 20% concentrated. They've done that for 100 years. The quality of the ore was going down and down and down, and it was down at like 0.5%. They realized they were going to have to build another copper concentrator to get the same level of output. That was a $200 million CapEx investment. As they looked at that, they said, you know what, the copper market global price is wobbling, and is it really worth this $200 million CapEx investment? So what they did was they said, let's give us a year. Let's see if we can figure out another way to get more out of the existing assets rather than putting in this giant CapEx investment. And at that site, they had a very sort of progressive site leader and a very progressive technology leader at the site. And they said, let's actually figure out if we can digitally optimize this site. And they mapped out the process of running this copper concentrator. And it turns out there are 42 different decision points, from everything from how big a safety stock do you have, how long do the trucks queue for, what are the set points on the various controllers inside the concentrator. And what they found was if you actually built the mathematical optimizer of these 42 decision points, a lot of the things they've been doing for a long time, a lot of the conventional wisdom, was simply wrong, right? You actually didn't need the safety stock to be as high as it was. You could have run it much lower. In the past, what people would have thought would have been a fireable offense for a shift operator was actually the right way to run it. Or the trucks queuing up. They'd said in the past you should only have 1 to 2 trucks in a line. Turns out 3 to 4 was the optimal number. Or the temperature at which they ran the plants and so on. They realized that through running these optimizations, they were able to get a 10% improvement in process yield. That's actually gone up since then. That's a big enough number to avoid the need for them making this $200 million CapEx investment. They actually got an improvement in safety as well because it changed some of the sort of the operational parameters that they were running in the plant. And this has been so significant for them that they basically announced a change in strategy that said it's now going to be about getting more out of existing assets rather than building new holes in the ground. The rest of the copper industry then decided to copy them, but they were far enough down the learning curve that they think they've stayed ahead. And if you look at their increase in output relative to others, there's good evidence that actually this truly is a learning curve and they've stayed ahead. So that's one sort of classic industrial story on how to approach it. But I would say for any company, industrial or not, start at the top, right? What are the couple of levers that are really going to drive value for your business? What's your equivalent of the copper concentrator output number? And figure out what are the different approaches. And it shouldn't be a GenAI strategy, it should be an AI strategy. What are the different things you can apply to that to try to make a difference? So with that, thank you. Pleasure to be here.